Hi. So, a couple of weeks ago I announced on this channel that I've retired from my position as a professor of psychology at the University of West Georgia. It all happened rather suddenly as a result of the corona apocalypse, of course, but also in combination with the financial turmoil that's gripped much of the academic world. Anyhow, since I'm now definitely in the throes of that big life transition, I thought it'd be a good idea to make a video about what it's like. Of course, at first this might seem to be just an okay boomer video that's mostly irrelevant to younger people's lives. But I don't think that's actually true. After all, how are any of us able to retire well, or to enter old age well more generally, if not by living toward that eventuality at every point along the way? So the topic of retirement may actually be more relevant to everyone's life path than it might seem at first. Anyhow, here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video. As you can see, I'd first like to explore retirement in terms of the relationship between freedom and intrinsic motivation, and then turn my attention to exploring the temporality of retired life. And as usual, you can find the same roadmap in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. Yeah, so in my own experience, I'd say that one of the most immediately striking things about retiring has to do with how many people are going out of their way to congratulate me for it, which of course feels pretty good. I suspect that part of that is coming from the inertia of simple social convention, since we tend to say congratulations at times like that, partly because that's just what we're supposed to do. But I sense that another, somewhat deeper part is coming out of people's genuine happiness for me, as if I've managed to obtain something for which most of us really yearn, namely, the chance to lay aside the storm and stress of our daily labors, not merely for a weekend or a vacation, but as an entirely new and abiding pattern for our lives. It feels a little like being congratulated for winning the lottery. Not so much because it's some sort of tremendous personal accomplishment, but because I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Like, I just kept hitting the ball whenever they'd pitch it to me, and so now I've made it to the last inning. But then the question probably becomes, okay, but what makes that such a desirable thing to so many of us in the first place? Well, I suspect it's mostly because a lot of us secretly long to spend our lives doing mostly what we ourselves want to do, rather than fulfilling someone else's desires. Basically, to be the captains of our own ships, rather than galley slaves in someone else's. And to me, that's perfectly understandable, and it's definitely part of my own personal experience. But on the other hand, retirement is also somewhat of a challenge, even for those of us who've already taken care of our financial and practical needs well ahead of time. That's because it's all too easy to underestimate the sense of meaning we get from our work, how it provides us with a purpose for our days, as well as an orientation to the world, and even an overall sense of who we are in the process. And here I'd like to inject a little wisdom from Viktor Frankl's famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Basically, what Frankl discovered in the Nazi concentration camps is that the most fundamental force in human affairs doesn't actually consist of any sort of will to pleasure or even happiness. Instead, our most fundamental motivation is toward meaning, which he conceives in terms of striving to attain worthwhile goals, as well as struggling to contribute something significant to the larger run of life, even if doing so involves a fair amount of discomfort, pain, and unhappiness. Sure, it may be a wonderful socially sanctioned fantasy to dream about lounging around listlessly for the rest of our lives, languidly sipping mint juleps in an unending sybaritic haze. But according to Frankl, that's not what the good, ultimately satisfying life is all about. It just seems that way because so many of us feel overly burdened, overly taxed and depleted, and overly beholden to desires that are not really our own. But as Frankl observes, genuine fulfillment is not about existing in a tensionless state. In reality, fulfillment is somewhat stressful. Not overly stressful, of course, but stressful enough so that we actually have to strive for things. In other words, the good life involves a meaningful tension between what we've done with our lives and what remains undone, between what we are and what we could be in this world. And that doesn't go away when we reach our 60s and beyond. In that regard, the challenge of retirement is basically about a kind of balance. On one hand, it's not about being overly stressed, especially by having to fulfill other people's desires all day long. But on the other hand, it's not about a lack of stress either, because that would be tantamount to a lack of meaning in our lives. Instead, it's about learning to dwell in the middle ground between those two extremes, which is probably where most of us would have wanted to be all along. But attaining that kind of balance isn't necessarily easy when we've become inured to being overly stressed by the work world in various ways, and then suddenly thrust into a retirement that doesn't offer us much meaningful tension at all. And so, at this early juncture in my own retirement process, I suspect that a big part of the challenge has to do with finding a new source of meaningful tension, some new goal to be pursued, and some new way of contributing to the larger order of things. But, of course, that means that when we're no longer driven by the spurs of pure practical necessity, we're actually going to have to choose a meaning for our existence, rather than simply deferring to one that's more or less automatically there for us by dint of our careers. In other words, part of the psychological shift of retirement has to do with moving from a set of externally imposed extrinsic motivations to ones that are much more intrinsic in nature and that consequently have to do with fulfilling the inherent value of our involvements and ultimately our lives, quite apart from whatever incentives the world would offer us for them. But in talking about choosing our involvements for intrinsic reasons, we're starting to invoke the language of freedom, which I'd say is definitely one of the big challenges of retired life. Basically, the question is, if we reach a point in our lives when we can be any kind of person, filling our days with whatever we decide, then what would our lives start to look like? Who and what would we be if not a professor or a bricklayer or a secretary? And once again, that might sound like paradise, at least at first. However, as existential thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre have noticed, when it comes down to it, freedom and the sense of responsibility that comes along with it are actually mixed blessings. In fact, most of us do everything in our power to avoid being free and usually prefer various states of enslavement to having to decide for ourselves in a responsible way. For instance, we often disown our fundamental freedom and responsibility by making excuses for ourselves. We blame other people for problems which are ultimately of our own making. Or perhaps we attribute them to more systemic conditions in our world, all of which is sometimes known in clinical psychology as blame shifting. And when we're desperately and indignantly trying to blame other people for our problems, what we definitely don't want is to be reminded that the main variables that determine the quality of our lives actually have to do with our own choices, as well as our own willingness to assume responsibility for them. Sartre calls those sorts of evasions and duplicitous maneuvers bad faith, and they're extremely common in human affairs, which I think you can easily notice if you just turn on the news for a few minutes these days. But perhaps a more immediately relevant example of bad faith with respect to the issue of retirement would have to do with our relationship with money, and hence with our desires for immediate gratification, all of which is crystallized in the all too common phenomenon of living with high levels of debt. For instance, most of us probably realize, at least nominally, that retirement will eventually become a very practical issue in our lives. But that realization doesn't seem to dissuade us very often from accumulating high levels of debt, which of course is a big part of what keeps us chained to the workaday world. However, one thing I've learned along life's road is that the most valuable thing that our money can buy isn't any particular commodity. Instead, the most valuable thing our money can buy is the time of our lives, so that we can live from moment to moment like we really want to. In other words, the most desirable commodity of all is our personal liberty, which in reality is something that's much more satisfying than possessing any shiny bauble or the latest smartphone or a new pair of shoes or a nice car, etc. That's because what we really want when we buy expensive trinkets like those is to experience life in a certain way. And while the warm thrill of ownership can certainly be seductive and temporarily satisfying, it's really nothing compared to the exhilaration of feeling finally and definitively unchained from the yoke of financial servitude and emancipated from everything that would force us to do other people's bidding all day long. But instead of recognizing that fairly obvious reality, most of the time we simply keep our eyes focused on the next gimmick, mostly because it actually takes courage to admit that we're in the habit of keeping ourselves enslaved through our own choices, that we ourselves are the source of our enslavement. And so, for a lot of us, a fair fraction of adult life ends up being about working jobs we hate to buy shit we don't need, as Tyler Durden once put it. And okay, maybe he overstates the case a bit when he uses the word hate. Probably most of us don't actually hate what we do, but I bet that if we had any kind of choice in the matter, most of us probably wouldn't want to do our jobs 40 hours per week, no matter how pleasant our work actually is. And here I'd like to mention a somewhat politically incorrect, possibly idiosyncratic realization I've had over the years, and it's this. Aside from sleeping, there's nothing in this world I actually want to do 40 hours every week. Sure, I love teaching. I love teaching college classes and interacting with my students, but I don't want to do it 40 hours per week because, well, because that's way too much of that and way too little of everything else. I also love playing that demon rock and roll, but I don't want to do that 40 hours per week either. I love meditating. I love woodworking. I love archery. I love many other things, but 40 hours per week is just way too much for any of the things I love. And in my doubtlessly boundless narcissism, I suspect that that's true of a lot of other people too. Okay, occasionally there's a Mozart or a Magnus Carlsen who's perfectly content with doing music or chess or whatever practically all of the time. But I don't think that most of us are constructed that way. And so I've come to the conclusion that one of the big reasons why retirement seems like a consummation devoutly to be wished, as Shakespeare put it, is that the demands of the work world are fundamentally at odds with the polymorphous nature of our human desires. And that's also why the whole fantasy of finding a career that we can really love can be such a slippery and elusive thing. It's not just because it's hard to find something we love that the world will actually pay for, which is already a pretty big challenge. The deeper difficulty has to do with the fact that most of us aren't too content with being one-trick ponies in the first place. And yet, the professional world seems to demand exactly that a lot of the time. Mostly because it's an ideal woven into our collective vision of expertise, which is what differentiates paid professionals from unpaid amateurs. And sure, it's certainly a wonderful thing to be a paid expert in something, but it's also a wonderful thing to pursue multiple interests and passions while we're alive. And with retirement comes an opportunity to do exactly that, which I suspect is another reason why it seems so desirable. And yeah, it is a wonderful thing to be able to drop all of the weight of having to be an expert in one relatively small circumscribed thing, and then to begin exploring the larger horizon of life's possibilities. To become perhaps more like an unfettered child in that regard, moving from one thing to another simply for the intrinsic joy of it, and not because we need to establish and maintain ourselves as paid professionals in something. And so, for me personally, even at this early juncture in the retirement process, it feels like I'm heading toward becoming something like a child of the universe, instead of just another paid expert satisfying society's desires. Okay, sidebar moment. Speaking of experts who are paid to satisfy other people's desires, you know, I've never really understood why our culture looks down on prostitutes and prostitution so much. After all, isn't it the case that around 99% of us end up prostituting ourselves in one way or another? Some of us are college professors and consequently end up prostituting our brains. Others of us are physical laborers who end up prostituting our hands and backs. And still others have to run around all day and consequently end up prostituting our legs. And then there are those of us who are literal prostitutes who end up selling our sexuality. So, why is prostituting one part of our bodies necessarily any worse than prostituting another part? Seems a little bit arbitrary when you think about it, doesn't it? And anyhow, aren't we all whores in the end? True, some of us are happy hookers who actually like to turn tricks for the world, and others of us aren't so sanguine about it. That's true. But practically all of us are whores of one sort or another. So then, why are we so quick to disparage prostitution? Well, maybe in a way prostitutes are simply being honest and straightforward about something that runs throughout all of our lives. Actually, I might have answered my own question there, because maybe we hate and disparage them precisely because they're being honest about something we can't admit. But I digress. Okay, so let's try to get this video back on track after that rather unsavory interlude. Kind of put the lewd in interlude, didn't it, there for a minute? I know, right? Anyhow, I'm discovering that another somewhat challenging side of retired life has to do with temporality. Basically, how we experience time. Part of that's due to the fact that most of us live out the largest fraction of our adult lives in a way that's thoroughly regulated by the clock and calendar of the workaday world. Retirement, of course, means that there's a lot less of that. But more importantly, in the workaday world, the time that we can genuinely call our own is a relatively scarce and precious commodity when you think about it. For instance, for most of us, the weekend consists of 2 days out of 7, which is 28.56% of the week. But when you think about it, we don't really get to enjoy that 28.56% of our lives, because the first part of our weekend is probably about decompressing and recovering from the stress of our work week. So actually, when you think about it, that 28.56% is really more like, what, maybe 20%. But actually, we don't really get that 20% either. That's because most of us have to spend at least part of our weekend doing all the annoying chores we couldn't get done during the work week. You know, things like mowing the lawn, washing the clothes, paying the bills, cleaning the gutters, etc. So probably that 20% is really whittled down to something like, oh, I don't know, maybe 13%. But then again, we don't really get to enjoy that 13% either. That's because a lot of us spend at least part of Sunday anticipating and dreading the upcoming work week. So probably that 13% is really more like, what, 7% when you really think about it. Probably getting the picture, which is that the time we really get to call our own is a relatively scarce commodity. And so then the terroristic question becomes, how much of our lives is really our own? And the equally terroristic answer is probably not that much. But with retirement, that calculus changes, or at least it can change. Instead of living in a state of temporal scarcity, we finally get the chance to live in a state of temporal abundance. Of course, for most of us, that happens only when our physical capacities are starting to deteriorate. But hey, it's better than nothing. Anyhow, because of that relative abundance, we can finally slow down and let go of the feeling like we have to be living so frenetically so much at the time. I remember being a little amused by that when I was a kid, when I noticed that people who objectively seemed to have the least amount of time left in this world would usually drive the slowest. I thought that was a little funny because when you think about it, if you didn't have much time left in this world, it might be important to get to wherever you're going relatively quickly. But that's not how it works most of the time. And now that I'm old myself, I can see why. It's because we older people actually have the most amount of time, subjectively speaking. In other words, in terms of how we actually experience time, even if we also have the least amount of time, objectively speaking. So, a little unexpectedly, it turns out that those of us who have the least time actually have the most time. And that's because when we're living in a state of psychological temporal abundance, we don't have to run around like coked up tweaker rhesus monkeys because, well, because there's no real reason for that in the first place. Anyhow, speaking of not having as much time left in this life, at this point I should probably make note of the relationship between retirement and mortality. And for the most part, it has to do with the fact that disengaging from the work world tends to demarcate the final season of our lives, and hence to make the inevitable approach of death much more obvious, which somewhat paradoxically makes taking our time about things even more compelling. That's because death's cold and unsettling touch has a way of compelling us to pass beyond all of the relatively second-rate ways we have of moving through this world, and then to begin living toward the actual depth of human existence, to feel all that life is asking us to feel, if only in our final waning season, when winter's gray chill is beginning to coax the last withered leaves from our barren branches, and the leaden sky above us is growing heavy with the promise of falling snow. Retirement is, among its other charms, an intimation of finality, a harbinger of the unraveling and falling apart of things, and the eventual disintegration of all of our powers and capabilities and talents that once shone so radiantly in the erstwhile summertime of our lives. And so the essential and increasingly salient question becomes how to begin the process of ending, how to move through the harrowing season of undoing with some measure of grace, decency, and dignity, and perhaps even wisdom. Basically, how to move through those days in a way that remains faithful to everything we've become in this life and everything we've ever been. And in that respect, I'd say that the essential challenge of retirement is the challenge of learning to let go, of learning to surrender when the time is right, and of learning to see through the many veils of permanence and stability that surround us, and perhaps in the final analysis, to enter, maybe more fully and more powerfully than ever before, into the seething fluxion that is this world, that is life and death. Anyhow, that's what retirement seems like to me, at least at this early point in the process. But maybe some of you out there in YouTube land are a little more experienced than I am in that regard. And so if that's true, I'd love to hear your own experiences and insights. So feel free to write down a thing or two in the comments section if you are so inclined. And of course, many thanks to each and every one of you for watching and listening. And as always, take care of your soul.